We are approaching a time when, in the near future, unpaid student debt will hit a tipping point. And yet, a college degree does not necessarily get you a good career these days. Meanwhile, tuition, housing, books, and other associated costs of quote-unquote higher education are at an all-time high. So is college really worth it? We'll answer that question today and get into the debate over gun ownership as well with our guest. She is currently a college student at George Mason University. She is also a political writer, cabinet member with Future Female Leaders. She is a speaking coach and becoming one of the most respected voices for conservative women. Please welcome Natalia Castro. Welcome back, Natalia.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me again.
So you are a senior at George Mason, is that right?
Yes, it's true.
Okay, my daughter is a sophomore at another college in the country here, and she has a scholarship, thank goodness. So we see the bills come through still as a matter of formality, and it's a very expensive process, and I'm sure you see that as well. But it's not just the student incurring this, because government gets involved. I have an article here in front of me from John Stossel, who does a lot of these expose type of articles and news stories. And he says that government pours about $80 billion a year into college subsidies. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. The government plays a huge role in what they call funding universities. But what we've actually seen is almost every year as government subsidies to higher education institutions increases, we also see an increase in college tuition. So it's almost a double whammy for a lot of us who are currently paying for college, and also as a taxpayer are paying for a lot of higher education. So, it's been we've seen huge rises in tuition costs, huge rises in federal subsidies for higher education, and it's only getting more expensive.
Well, let me ask you this. As you've had a lot of success in your collegiate career so far, you've got a lot of notoriety and you're making great strides. Would you say that college is worth it? Yes or no? And maybe that depends on who you are.
I think it definitely depends on the student. I know for me, and this is a little controversial to say, I'm going to be honest, but I feel like my degree is in a big way a formality. I really liked engaging with the industry. I'm a very much a work person, so as soon as I could get an internship, I did, and then I kind of turned it into a job. And one thing I've noticed is there is so much pressure to get a degree, to go to college, that we don't talk to students about other avenues, and we don't talk to students about succeeding without a degree. I work with someone who, instead of going to college, immediately started working political campaigns. And, they were in the campaign world for years and then ended up working with the Republican National Committee, never got a college degree, but is to this day one of the most, prominent people within the conservative movement. And this idea that you have to get a degree is very much a new idea that has been pushed on a lot of students like myself.
So what does a student do where if they see it the way you do, and you don't necessarily need to get a 4-year degree, and yet they get out into the world and every employer is requiring a 4-year degree? They don't care if it has anything to do with the job that you're going for. They just want a degree. Well, what does a person do in that case?
Well, it is a very difficult situation, and it's a reason that a lot of students go to college and, end up trying to do the whole college thing, is because they feel like it's their only option. But the negative side to that we're seeing is a lot of students who aren't graduating in 4 years. Now, more and more students are taking 5 to even 6 years to complete their degree. And a lot more students are ending up underemployed because they were spending so much time trying to get a degree that they don't have the job skills to actually get into the right career paths. So, my route, the route that I chose to take was, take my college classes. I actually take a lot of online classes and then engage in the industry that I want to be in as much as possible. But for a lot of other students, they feel so swamped in the idea of getting a degree that they never really get the work experience that they need.
And that's sort of upside down as far as a biblical principle, isn't it? I mean, we're supposed to look after our money and be good stewards of what Jehovah gives us. And it seems that the cost of having a college education, it used to be a little bit different. We'll get into that a little bit later. But right now, it seems like that is almost dare I say, almost an unbiblical way to go about life.
Well, I think it really, it's for every individual trying to find the route that works best for them. And by putting everyone in this cookie cutter route of, you go to high school, you go to college, you get a job, we're not setting people up for success because we're not allowing people to find the avenues that best fit what they want to do with their life. There are so many individuals who, rather than getting a 4-year degree, would be much better off with a 2-year degree or even just a vocational training or some form of a training course. But we don't encourage people to do that because we're so busy trying to fit them into a cookie cutter mold. And I agree with the idea that it's unbiblical because we're not focusing on the individual and the talents that individual can bring to the table. Instead, we're just trying to make them be what we think they should be.
Absolutely right. My brother-in-law is a good example of what you're just speaking about. He was going to try for college, but he never really did that well in high school, and so he didn't have the grades to make it. However, he went to plumber school, and in his first year being a plumber, made more than some of his friends who took the 4-year degree and started work, and he's making more money than they are.
Absolutely. And that's another thing that I think is a really big problem in our culture today is that we've put so much pressure on going to college that a lot of students don't realize being a plumber, being a handyman, any of those kinds of middle skilled jobs can make just as much as your office job, as working in the civil service. They can be high paying jobs. And we don't let students know that. And I think that is to the detriment of a lot of students who would be incredible in these vocational trainings and wouldn't rack up hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt trying to get a degree that isn't going to be useful for them. I think it is truly a sin that we allow students to, rack up such horrible levels of debt for an education that might not even be what's best for them.
True, and even though maybe, as you call them, middle skill jobs, it's not that I should say, my brother-in-law, it's not that he wasn't smart. He was smart in different ways. He understands plumbing in brilliant ways that I can't even wrap my head around. So everyone has their own gifts from Yehovah as what they need to do in life. And just because they don't get into the college they want, they shouldn't give up because maybe that's not where he wants them.
And I think that's a big problem with our, we talk a lot about higher education, government subsidies to higher education, tuition costs, that stuff. And it's a really big issue, but it really does start in our early education. And when we have educational policies that, like a lot of the standardized tests where teachers have to teach for the test, they're not finding the individual talents in every student. They're not seeing, oh, this student's never going to take a test well, but look at the art he creates with his hands. Like, we're not looking at those talents within children because we're trying to fit them into a mold. And it ignores the talents that they've received. And it's a big problem.
So why do you think, let's get back to the cost of education. Why do you think, or what are the reasons, maybe you know them off the top of your head, why education has risen so much and it seems so quickly, the cost of that?
It's hard to pinpoint one reason, but I've looked at a lot of charts. I like the statistics behind this stuff. And it's shocking to see how as government subsidies for educational institutions have increased, there has been an almost exact increase in the amount of tuition that schools charge. So theoretically, when the government gives universities more money, schools should be lowering tuition costs. But schools aren't lowering tuition costs. They're raising them, and they're trying to create more amenities on campuses. We have college campuses that have water parks on them for no reason, while they're receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars in government subsidies. So it really is one of those issues of where is our government money going? Because it seems like it's allowing colleges to further scam their students rather than actually benefit their education.
That's absolutely true. My daughter just the other day mentioned to me, she says, you know what, Dad, my school has way too much money. It's a continual construction zone. They're adding on to the stadium. They're building this building. They're building that building. She says, I'm not even sure what they're going to need it for.
Yeah, Exactly. And a lot of the students who are paying into it aren't even going to see most of the benefits for it because they're only going to be there for 4 years. And so it's a very unfortunate circumstance where I think a lot of universities are scamming their students out of a significant amount of money. And in that, coupled with this idea that everyone should go to college, really creates an environment where universities can profit much more than they should.
Indeed. Now, what percentage of students actually leave school and find a job within a year or so? Are there stats on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Investors Business Daily recently did a study really analyzing millennial work and college and like the relationship between the two. And one of the most stunning statistics that I found is 40% of millennials who graduate college with a degree move back home to live with their parents and aren't able to get their own houses and get successful jobs. That's 45%. It is a 75-year high. So think about what that means. That means millennials, kids my age, are graduating college. They're not starting families. They're not getting married. They're moving back home. They can't get a job, and they're unable to be that productive member of society. So it doesn't just affect the workforce, but it also affects our family building and how, our culture as a whole, when you have millennials that aren't able to start their lives, after college, like maybe their parents were.
And just not having them get a job is one thing, but the student debt they leave behind unpaid is another. I recently talked to a stock trader friend of mine, and he says just as we had a real estate bubble back in 2007, 8, and 9, we are approaching a college debt bubble that is creating the very same problem. A whole bunch of debt is going to be unpaid, and it's going to cause some calamity.
Absolutely. And we're seeing in New York, some legislation recently passed with the idea of making college free for everyone, which is a really great idea. Of course, we want everyone to have free college, but what it's actually ending up doing is exacerbating that already apparent problem of these rising student loan costs that are eventually going to fall on the federal government when these students default and are unable to pay for these loans. And what the New York policy did is it basically took in so many more extra costs that we have a government that can't sustain itself because of how much money they're trying to take on the responsibility of. And again, it encourages this idea that everyone should go to college. And that's not how our economy is built.
So, okay, well, if college is not getting us jobs, then why do people continue to go?
Well, the idea of a degree has been really poorly inflated. So one thing that you mentioned earlier is a lot of employers just look for that degree, even if it's not in the same, even if it's not exactly in the area that the employer is looking for, but they just know to look for that degree. I know when I was in middle school and high school, we were told really early that if you have a degree, you'll get a better job. And that's actually not statistically true, that you're going to get this high-paying job if you have a degree, because the value of a degree has been so overly inflated. But it's a big cultural problem that we've put so much pressure on the degree that we're not actually paying attention to the degree's worth.
It's the same inflation is happening. I brought up it earlier at another show about a physician friend of mine who's a dermatologist, and he used to prescribe a skin cream that was worth $30. And then after government got involved and subsidies and insurance and all the rest of it put their hands in it, overnight, that $30 vial of medicine went from $30 to $300. So this is the problem when you have subsidies involved, that everyone along the way is trying to get a piece of the action. So here's my question. Would getting rid of government subsidies cause the cost of education to go down? What do you think?
I absolutely think so. And it's something that I don't just think, but that we have seen. When the government rolls back funding on certain institutions, the institutions have to cut costs to become more competitive and allow more students to enter to actually want to go to the school, rather than just kind of have the government system to put them in the school. So I think that it allows for there to be competition within the market that is natural and not government inflated. Colleges are part of the free market, and we often don't think of it that way. But colleges should have to offer lower tuition as an incentive to have students there. And instead, because of government subsidies, they don't have to do that. They kind of just rely on the idea that, well, everyone wants to go to college, so everyone's going to come if they want, And that's a really big part of the problem, is that we don't look at universities as institutions within the free market.
So how do we start reforming this? I mean, are there any ideas out there? Has anyone started anything to try and get on the right side of this?
Unfortunately, not really. I think that in order to reform it, there needs to be a two-part solution that so part one has to be removing the subsidies, or at least some of the subsidies, to higher education institutions. That's extremely important. That's just like we've talked about for this whole show, it creates a huge problem. But the other half of it has to come from our elementary and K through 12 education, because the fact that we prepare students so much for the idea of college, we give them the standardized tests, we put them in a mold so young that we don't allow them to look at other avenues. And I think that kind of encouraging students to enter into those programs from a young age is really beneficial. I went to a high school in Florida that actually had an agricultural program attached to the high school because we are such an agricultural state. And I directly saw the benefits of that, where there were students who were learning a skill rather than being told, go to college, go to college, go to college. And so there was a group of students who saw other paths that they could take rather than just the college path. And it was very beneficial, I think, for a lot of those students. And having more programs like that on the high school level could encourage that activity.
I think you're right, because, a lot of homeschoolers end up, taking classes where the mother or the father, whoever's in charge of the homeschool, would say, well, what are you interested in? Let's form your school around that, rather than throwing everybody into, like you said before, the same mold, even in elementary school and elementary and high school. And instead, they then focus on what they're good at, and often they can form a career without even going to college.
Absolutely. And it's a big part of it, like you said, is that a lot of students don't realize that these are high paying jobs. Like, these are not, when we talk about agricultural work, when we talk about plumbing, these aren't low income jobs. And I think that part of the stigma attached to this idea of not going to college is that you'll never make a lot of money. And that is a really negative stigma that's hurting a lot of our students who have skills that would be better suited in these industries. And I think that kind of removing that stigma from a young age is a really important way of kind of solving this whole problem.
Yeah, and I think that some of it is not even known. For example, the higher wages, like you said, with some of the other jobs you've mentioned, even a computer programmer. I mean, by the time a computer programmer goes to school for 4 years, the entire shape of programming has changed by the time they get out. It's better for that person to have innate skills and just to get a job. I know that's several...
and to directly in the industry. Absolutely. Engaging in the industry you want to be part of at a young age is extremely important, because what you said is very true. In the world that we're living in today, in 4 years, the things you learned year one are outdated in a lot of different, in the tech industry, but in a lot of different industries. And so, teaching students to have your skills, do a training course that refines your basic skills, and then engage directly within the industry to build off of that is really beneficial.
I want to get into something maybe that you've experienced in college, and I know my daughter has as well. I want to get your take on it. But first, I want to ask this question regarding the whole money situation. So how is our society better if only those who could afford it actually went to college? Do you think there'd be a benefit there?
That's an interesting question. I think that a college needs to be accessible to students who would, I think whoever believes that they could benefit the most from a college degree should have the opportunity to go for college. But I think that needs to be led by the private sector in the form of like scholarships rather than led by the public sector in the form of government subsidies and grants. Because when it's led by the public sector in the form of government subsidies and grants, it does what we talked about before, where then colleges go in and they raise prices to match the government subsidies, and it doesn't actually benefit the student. But when you do it through the private sector and it's through scholarship, then not only does that student they're enriched by the idea that they received this scholarship, but a lot of times they also can get mentors and they can be helped through the college process rather than just from the government being handed a check and saying, go enjoy college. So I think that when it's that the scholarship is offered by the private sector and through private groups, it becomes more about enriching the student as a whole rather than just giving the student money so that they can go to college.
So a hand up rather than a handout, as we talked about in our welfare segment in the last show.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so as a blanket statement, would you say that college is a scam? Yes, no, or what are the reasons?
I think for a lot of students, college is a scam. It is not a scam for everyone. I know students who have gone through the university process, have become masters, have become PhDs, and have really benefited. I think a lot of young entrepreneurs that have gone through college have really benefited. But institutions as a whole have taken advantage of a lot of students as well. And for a lot of those students, it has become a scam.
I want to ask something maybe a little bit left field here, as we have a few minutes left in this segment. Not so much about the money about college and whether it's worth it or not, but now the experience of college for a believer. I know my daughter went to college and we were very concerned because every parent has heard the horror stories that once your Christian child, your believing child, goes to college, college is going to unravel everything you've tried to teach them in the previous 18 years of their life. And by the time they walk out in 4 years, they're going to be an atheist. Have you found that to be true in your experience?
I believe I've been truly blessed by a very strong Christian and, for me personally, Catholic community within my university. I definitely sought that out when I first came to my university. I found our on-campus biblical groups and stuff like that, which has been really fulfilling for me. But I have also seen a lot of students move away from their faith because of there's a very liberal, but not just liberal, very atheist views in colleges that kind of, they want to take you out of your traditional thinking, not realizing that a lot of benefits come from our having a strong foundation and having strong principles. So I do think that there is an issue within colleges of promoting a very, secular ideology. But I think that if a student goes into college and knows that this is my principles and I'm going to seek out ways to maintain my principles on my campus, that is absolutely possible in most universities. I can't speak for every university, but I know I was able to find a really strong and really heartwarming groups at my university that kind of always bring me back home. So
I think you hit the nail on the head. You searched out groups. You didn't go into college with the ethereal thinking of, well, I'm just going to go and find myself. I don't know who I am. I'm just going to explore everything. And I think that's how people get into trouble. Would you say that that is the case too?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people, and man, this is, I think, a whole problem with college. Another big issue within college is this idea that you can go to college and you'll figure it out as you go. You'll figure it out along the way. And okay, yeah, you're growing up. You'll figure some stuff out along the way, but you need to know what your principles are and you need to know what you believe in and you need to try to maintain that. And I think when you start from a strong foundation, you can build on it very well within college. But if you don't have that strong foundation, it's very easy to get lost.
Indeed. I want to give a story about my daughter who the first person she encountered on campus in her first week there was someone from Athletes in Action. Athletes in Action is a Christian organization that caters specifically to athletes, of course. And before you know it, she was invited to a Bible study. And now she goes to Bible studies and Christian events, and she even went to a recent camp run by Athletes in Action. And she's more engaged with her Creator than she ever was, even as we were bringing her up in a very Christian home. And so I think it can be quite a blessing if people just look for those opportunities to stay connected in their faith and find groups like you did, Natalia.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I have heard so many beautiful stories of students who were raised in very secular households who, their college roommate happened to be a Christian, happened to be a Catholic, and they started going to Bible studies together and they started going to church together. And I've even attended some really beautiful baptisms of students who are, 20, 21 years old who have found faith. So for a lot of the very concerned parents about children going to college and losing their faith, there are also so many beautiful stories of children finding their faith.
So I'm going to take you 3 years back to your first week as a freshman and some advice that now that you've seen the last few years, what are some pointers or some advice that you would give to parents who are sending off their kids for the first time right now at this time of year to college for their first year? What should that student do? What should that student not do in order to maintain their faith at college?
I think, like I said, the first step is figuring out the groups on campus that are going to be positive and productive for that student. Like I said, I was able to find, Bible studies and Catholic organizations on my campus, but it looks different on every campus. I know a lot of women who joined a big on-campus college organization called the Network of Enlightened Women. That's a conservative book club that girls get together and they read books about conservative principles and often religious principles together. And I think there are so many different on-campus organizations that cater to your faith in a different way. And just finding the one that works for you is really beneficial. And for the parents out there, you really never know how it's going to go. So just say a prayer for your child and believe that if you gave them the right foundation, they will be able to succeed with it.
Excellent advice. Thank you, Natalia. All right, well, up next, we're going to speak to Natalia about gun ownership from several different angles. But first, we need to set our sights, as it were, on getting the message you hear on this program to the world. And the only person who can do that is you. We have no corporate sponsors, no foundation or trust account to pull from. We use the funds you provide to make this program happen. Without you, this program disappears, quite frankly. Right now, I'm asking you to prevent that from happening. Stand with us, as Michael Rood would say. Stand up, make your donation count. Thank you for in advance. We just finished speaking with Natalia Castro about college and whether it is a scam or not. And now we're going to get into something completely different, gun ownership. Natalia, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Now, as we've discussed in previous programs, and as most of our viewers know, I'm originally from Canada, and in Canada, guns are taboo. If you are the guy on your block with a gun, you are the weird one. You're the one to look out for. You're the dangerous guy, and everyone's always got the one eye open on you. Here in the U.S., it seems especially in the South here, if you don't have a gun, then you're the weird one. So now let's look at that whole thought pattern. Has gun ownership changed in the U.S. over the last 20 years? And if so, how has it changed?
Well, I think it's really interesting because the United States has a really long history of gun ownership. And one thing that is very different from the United States and many other countries is that gun ownership is not just viewed as, something you're allowed to do, but it's viewed as a very intrinsic and basic right. And so in the United States, we see much more gun ownership than we do in a lot of other countries because of its long history. And I think in the last 20 to 30 years, largely because of media dynamics, the idea of being a gun owner has become a little bit more controversial than it was a long time ago. So while gun ownership is still, we still see a vast majority of Americans believe in gun ownership, believe in gun safety, we are seeing a lot of changing dynamics between how that is actually put into policy for the average person.
Now, let's talk about the media for a minute here. So the media over the last 20 years as well, their portrayal of gun ownership has changed, and I'm assuming that has a lot to do with the 24-hour news stations and every bit of tragedy they can get their hands on, their eyes go wide with dollar signs for the ratings. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of stories about gun violence sell much better than stories about self-defense. So one interesting study that came out last year, it was a Pew Research poll, discussed about how Americans view gun violence versus some actual facts about gun violence. And guns are actually used in self-defense much more often than they're used in violent crimes. But because of media portrayal, we don't see those stories about self defense. We instead see the stories about violence. And that has really affected the way that guns are viewed in our culture.
And that's just sort of our human nature, isn't it? We like to see the negative before we see the positive. It creates rumors and all that type of thing. And we like to have the gossip and all that. And it all flies in along with that side of things. But as I tell everyone else, my friends in Canada ask me, so after living in the States for a while, how do you feel about gun ownership? And I say, well, I don't own a gun, but those who do own guns, I support it because I firmly believe there are a lot more good guys in this world than there are bad guys.
Absolutely. And despite what the media portrays, there are so many more instances of people using guns to protect themselves that just don't get read about and don't get heard about. And it's true. There are so many more good guys with guns than there are bad guys with guns. But when we keep the conversation focused on the bad guys, it hurts the good guys' ability to defend themselves and protect themselves.
So how do you feel about gun ownership on a campus, for example? We've talked about this where you're a college student, and a lot of colleges have their own gun regulations for obvious reasons. There's been some tragedies in the past, but how do you feel about that? I mean, you used to live in a place where guns were commonplace.
Absolutely. So I originally grew up in Florida, and my father is a police officer. So from a very young age, I knew we had guns in the household. We had been shooting, and that was very much ingrained with me from a young age. And coming to college in the Northern Virginia, D.C. area, I learned very quickly that guns are very taboo here, and they are not as openly accepted as they are in Florida at all. And as a result of that, I came up here, and after long conversations with my family, we decided it was best for me to obviously not have a firearm. And for me personally, that has been scary. I'm very used to knowing everywhere in my house where if someone broke in, I could protect myself. And being a college student and not having access to that security is very frightening, especially as a very petite female. I'm sure people have talked about the statistics as far as sexual assault on college campuses. It's very, very common. And the fact that as a woman, I am not best equipped to protect myself in the event that, God forbid, a tragedy happened to me, it is very scary. And I know a lot of other women who traditionally are gun owners, it's a very scary transition for them as well.
So what are you allowed to do on the campus then? If you're not allowed to carry a gun, are you allowed to carry some form of self-protection?
I have been told by people on my campus, administrators, RAs, that I should take a self-defense class. You can't really tell right now, but I am about 4'11". So I'm not sure what a self-defense class will do, but they also encourage pepper spray, which I also have my reservations about. I know there's a big chance of back spray, and so they do offer options, but for someone like me who, no matter what, I'm going to be out of my comfort zone. So that's very much frustrating for me.
Now, something a lot of people don't think about is self-defense with a weapon is actually encouraged in the Bible. It's not to go around and hurt people, but one of the first things we're told as the apostles were told, that when you're going to go out, make sure you have a knife, and that was their form of protection. It was not to use as an aggressive means, but for defense.
No, of course. God gave us the ability to protect ourselves and has always told us to, use our skills to save ourselves and those around us. I will never forget when I actually lived in Florida when my home was broken into and my father wasn't around, wasn't home, and my mom, we hid in a small room and she had a firearm on her and we prayed. And I remember thinking, so thankful to God that he gave us the ability to know how to protect ourselves and to be able to, God forbid anything horrible happened, be able to protect ourselves, even though we never had to do anything in that situation. God bless it, all worked out really well, and we were all very safe. But it was a very clear time for me that I was very thankful that I was with my mother, who knew how to handle the situation so well. And so, yeah.
So you've been in the house when an intruder came in. Did that change ideas about firearms? Like, how young were you at the time?
I was a sophomore in high school, and the way it actually happened was my family was in the process of moving, and we weren't in the house that actually gotten broken into, but the house that was broken into was a street away from us. Like, we were literally like just a street away when the house was broken into, and it was after our previous house, the one that we were in, had already been broken into. So we were immediately fearful, and we immediately went into hiding. And like I said, my mother knew how to handle it in case there was any more issues with people came into our house. But luckily for us, they all stayed in the other house, and it never became a direct confrontation. But it definitely changed my views a lot. I mean, especially moving and living on my own for the first time. When I moved into my first adult apartment, that was always a concern for me is, I'll never forget that happening. I'll never forget having to go into hiding and how protected I felt when I had a firearm versus now when I don't. So I've seen both sides, and I definitely feel less safe now.
So now let's go back to the media for a second. The media makes it look like the U.S. is the most terrible place in the world, and if you come here, you're going to get shot. How is the media's coverage of mass shootings and just an average city's night's activities affected gun ownership?
Well, it's definitely had a large impact because the left loves to peddle this narrative that violence just doesn't happen in other countries, when in reality, in the UK, we've seen a huge spike in violent crime led by knives. So it's clear that even though guns are, very rare in the United Kingdom, knives are still a huge propeller of violent crime. So when we talk about violent crime in other countries, the media loves to compare U.S. gun crime to gun crime and countries that have no culture of gun use. And so, of course, they don't have gun crime, but that doesn't mean they don't have violent crime. So it's really, the media loves to make apples to oranges comparisons in order to push a narrative that isn't accurate and does have a negative impact on legal, lawful gun owners who have every right to carry and to protect themselves by our Constitution.
I think you're right. The American media is so prevalent, and every little story that happens with guns is going to get out there. And yet, again, when I lived in Canada, I tell people, they say, well, how do you feel living in the States where it's, guns everywhere? I said, I feel safer than I did in Canada because there's a lot of, like you said, knife crime in places where guns are not that common. And it seemed to me that knife crime was more prevalent, and the people who committed it tend to get off the hook, as it were, a little easier, and it just happened all the more because of that.
Yes, definitely. And it's important to also talk about who the victims are when we take guns out of the equation. A lot of times the people who really believe in arming themselves in self-defense the most are women, are low-income individuals, are people of color who really believe in just their basic right to self-defense. And when you take guns away from those people, you're putting already at-risk populations in even more danger. Like I talked a little bit about sexual misconduct on college campuses. You're basically taking away a woman's right to protect herself when at the same time pushing this narrative of, empowerment and feminism, but you don't want a woman to be able to protect herself. And so it's really a false narrative of protection and defense that is pushed by a lot of the more liberal groups who aren't even giving, these people the basic right to defend themselves.
So let's look at that. Let's look at this on a larger scale. So a college campus does not allow firearms. And then on a larger scale, we see places like you've mentioned in Virginia, D.C. specifically, New York City, Chicago. All these places have very tough gun laws. And they're some of the most violent places in the country. How do we equate this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon that places like Chicago, Baltimore, Detroit that have, some of the highest violent crime rates also have some of the strictest gun laws. And it's because when you take away an individual's right to legally own a firearm, a bad person who wants to use a gun is going to get a gun anyway. All it means is that they're going to look for more illegal black market methods of obtaining firearms that once you've broken into that level of criminality, it's only going to get worse. And so they're almost fueling a culture of crime and of violence by having such stringent laws against guns. And that's one of the reasons that, unfortunately, when it comes to mass shootings, mass public shootings, well over 90% of mass public shootings occur in areas that are gun-free zones or have very strict gun laws and with illegal firearms. Because rather than having legal avenues to protect oneself with firearms, you're increasing the number of illegal avenues for people to find firearms.
Well, I think you're right. People who are going to commit crimes are going to commit crimes. The last time I checked, it did not take a gun for someone to rent a Ryder truck and run it through a bunch of people. If they want to commit something, they're going to commit something. And that brings us to our next question. Maybe for ideological reasons, but obviously it's mentally disturbed. How much does mental illness play into all this?
Mental illness definitely plays a huge role in this. And I say that, but we also need to be careful when we say that. Because yes, mental illness plays a huge role in facilitating crime most of the time. But that doesn't mean everyone with mental illness is going to illegally obtain a gun and go on a shooting spree. I think that we need to be careful with removing a person's Second Amendment rights just because they have mental illness. There can't be a blanket policy for that. I think it needs to be left to individual therapists and mental health workers to be able to decide whether or not a person is equipped to carry a firearm, rather than some overreaching federal policy. So I think mental health needs to be taken more seriously across the board in order to better identify crime and identify who can and can't carry a weapon.
So how do we control that if there's so many guns out there that are unregistered, the numbers are stripped off, and they're just passing from person to person with nobody really knowing about it? How do we address that?
I think we need to focus on the people who we know shouldn't have guns. We need to focus on the criminals and people who, a lot of people who have been admitted to psychiatric facilities as known as being a risk to themselves or others. Those are the people who we should be focusing on preventing from having firearms, rather than your average hardworking American. And that's a big problem with gun control legislation, is that it puts blanket principles on who can and can't have guns, rather than actually focusing in on violent offenders and making sure they don't have guns. So I think having more specific policy aimed at, overseeing and monitoring those who we know shouldn't have guns, rather than looking at saying, okay, no one under 21 should have a gun. Well, that's not going to really help. Maybe we need to actually say who is on parole, who is out on parole from a violent crime under the age of 21. Let's do check-ins. Let's monitor their mental health to make sure that they're not finding a way to illegally obtain a gun.
So is there any legislation or hope of legislation in introducing the things you're talking about?
Unfortunately, right now, there is not, because it's very, very difficult to promote any legislation on the issue without having huge cries for gun control. And so if you ask me, I think when the federal government tries to have any legislation relating to gun ownership, it usually ends up being a problem. This needs to be the responsibility of state and local governments who are actually in touch with their constituents, who know their environment. The way that Massachusetts has their gun laws is going to be very different from a state like Alaska. where individuals live many individuals live in like wildlife terrain, and it's very natural for them to have a gun in their home to protect against animals, as opposed to maybe in Boston, you know? And I think that having a state government and state governments that monitor gun ownership is way more effective than having overreaching federal policy.
What do you see as the well, let me ask you this. Do you think it's more beneficial to own a gun than to not own a gun? How do you see that?
I do. I personally believe it's way more beneficial to own a gun than to not own a gun, because you'll always have that fail-safe. You'll always have that if push comes to shove and I need to use this, I can. That being said, that is the perspective of someone who grew up around guns. One of my best friends has never even seen a gun in person. She's only seen them in TV shows, and they terrify her. And she's told me that she doesn't feel like she could ever live with a gun because she really worries about having to use it one day and making a mistake, and using it wrong, or not knowing what she's doing and end up hurting herself more. So there are definitely people who maybe just because of the way that they were raised or their experiences, it's not beneficial for them to have a firearm, but that's the essence of freedom. If you do not believe it works for you, then you don't have to own it. But if I believe it works for me, I should be able to.
Now, what are the groups you're involved in? How are they addressing this issue of gun ownership?
Yeah, so one of the groups that I work really closely with is Stand for the Second, and I actually led an on-campus initiative dealing with Stand for the Second that just promotes awareness about the Second Amendment. So believe it or not, I've had a lot of people talk to me about the right to bear arms, but not the right to keep arms. So a lot of people will come to me and say, okay, if you want to have a firearm, then you shouldn't be able to keep it on you or in your house. You should have to have it in a locker somewhere and go. And if you want to go shooting or you want to go hunting, then you can borrow it then. And I tell them, well, hold on. You have to read the Constitution, which clearly says I have the right to keep a firearm. I have the right to have it in my home. I have the right to have it on me. So I think having general awareness about the power that the Second Amendment gives us is extremely important. And so, yeah, Stand for the Second is a really positive one that a group that I'm a part of.
Do you think it's possible to even change the media's mind as to how they portray this thing? Or is it out of control and we have to think of different ways to control the message now?
It's 2018, and I like to say we are the media. So if we want to change the narrative, there are a lot of hashtags. Hashtag 2A is a really popular one on Twitter where people will write their thoughts about the Second Amendment constantly, and a lot of people come out in support of it. So I think if we want to change the narrative of the media, it needs to be from a lot of gun owners who are taking to social media, who are taking to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and telling their stories. One of the beautiful things about social media is that I've seen so many more stories of people who've used guns in self-defense in the last year or two than I've ever seen reported by in the media. Because the media, like we talked about earlier, doesn't want to show the story of the woman who protected herself with a gun. They'd much rather show the story of some violent crime that happened. But we have the power to say, this is a situation where gun ownership saved me, and it needs to be told, so I'm going to tell my story.
Do you write many stories on this on your blog? I mean, is this one of the more popular one of the more popular topics you come across?
Definitely. I write about it really often, both on dailytorch.com. And as you spoke about earlier, I am a cabinet member with Future Female Leaders. And we also have a blog where we invite women to write about their stories with gun ownership. And I've personally written several stories kind of promoting this idea of female self-defense that I believe is very important. And I know a lot of women who have been able to share their stories thanks to a lot of these blogs like Future Female Leaders that kind of provide that avenue. So either of those resources are really great to learn more about gun ownership or your right to self-defense.
Let's say if one day the U.S. had a new law that guns were illegal, that they're all of a sudden all the guns were illegal. They were all going to be gathered up. What do you think would happen? What are the negative parameters of that, do you think?
Well, when you say that, it strikes a memory for me. That law has, not in the United States, but in Nazi Germany, that was one of the first actions that the Nazi Party instituted, was removing guns from all of the people of Germany. And it's one of the things that allowed Hitler to do the horrible things that he did, was because he disarmed the people. So that is just so scary for me to hear, because in every government that has turned tyrannical, that has taken over the people, that has instituted violence against the people, it started with making guns illegal. One of the things that in American history, a very dark spot that we like to forget, is that the first gun control laws, the first ever gun control laws, came in the Jim Crow era as a method of disarming Black individuals in the South. And that's very fearful. The Second Amendment was created as a protection for the people against the government, and that will always exist. And so I think it's very important that every American retain their right to defend themselves and fight for their right to defend themselves, because it is the first step in, unfortunately, losing a lot of the safety and security that we have.
Well, thank you, Natalia. This has been a very enlightening conversation on gun issues and owning a gun versus not owning a gun. And it's just been a pleasure speaking with you. And next week, you're going to be speaking with Annie Reed about some women's issues. You mentioned your future female leaders. And,
yes.
Yeah, very, very exciting there. And also some things about the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency or Act?
Agency.
All right. So we'll learn more next week. So thank you for watching today. Next time we'll have one final conversation, as I said, with Natalia Castro. Annie Reed will lead our conversation with Natalia about issues facing conservative women, how environmental protection affects your freedom. That'll be interesting. Well, we'll see you next time. Shavua Tov, and have a good week.